This video is sponsored by World of Tanks. Even if you've been painting miniatures for a while, painting a Warhammer tank can be intimidating. It's totally different from painting a normal miniature. So in this video, I'm going to show you several methods and approaches for painting beautiful Warhammer tanks to help you get your army on the table. Let's jump right into it. The first tank we're going to paint today is a Predator tank, a classic bit of Space Marine armor that's been through many iterations over the years, but remains largely the same. Today, I'm going to be painting a Demos Predator, the newest version that was released with the new edition of Horus Heresy. I'm going to be painting it in the Sons of Horus sea green color scheme, but the principles and techniques I apply here will be applicable to any color scheme in any chapter or legion. So let's get right into it. First things first, you can see I've assembled the tank in a way where the turret and side sponsons can come off. Doing this will make it easier to paint some of the hard to reach areas, and I start by priming the model a nice black. I'm using the airbrush here, but a rattle can would work just as well. What I want is a nice smooth coat that covers really well so that the deepest recesses are black for future steps. Simple. Next up is our first color. This is going to be a darker version of the main color that covers most of the tank. Since we're painting Sons of Horus today, we're going to go with Sons of Horus green. Again, I'm applying this through the airbrush, layering up many light coats to get a nice smooth finish. I'm applying most of the paint from the sides or the top. There's no need to go too much on the surfaces that point downward, as those will just read as shadow if there's some darker paint underneath there from the black undercoat. So it's time for the first big step that's going to make this thing look great. We're going to add some volume to this tank and highlight these boxy shapes. This method I'm about to show you was a big breakthrough for me. I used to never know how to highlight a boxy shape like this. With a normal miniature, you simply pretend there's a light source above and then paint all the upward facing planes a lighter color. Simple. However, with a boxy tank, if you do this, you'll just end up painting the sides a different color and it'll look weird. So what we're going to do is we're going to paint a gradient on the sides so the top part is darker and the bottom part is a bit lighter. Why would we do this? This seems counterintuitive. Let me show you using this wooden cube as an example. As you can see, with the light above, the corners are all clearly defined, and the top plane appears lighter than the side planes. Of course, our brain will tell us that this cube is all the same color, but if you take a picture and sample these colors, the side plane is of course a darker color. Now, if we flatten out the light, like it might be in some gaming spaces or display cabinets, then the whole thing looks like the same color, but the geometry becomes less obvious. It just looks flat. So here's the solution. By adding some darkness to the top of the side plane, our brain registers the change in angle that we would see if there was one clear light source. But by bringing back that same local color further down the plane, it still reads as one color no matter what the actual direction of the light is. This is very important, because oftentimes our rooms are full of sideways light from windows or diffused bounce light from white walls, whereas in nature the sun is usually the only light source, even if it's diffused by clouds or it's rising or setting. So punching up the lighting effect will help your tank to look more like a scale model and less like a toy, simply because of the environments it's going to be viewed in. So, to paint this on our model, we're simply going to look for the areas where a plane transitions into a steeper plane and highlight the edge there. I'm using my airbrush for this again, carefully choosing my angles to just kiss those edges with my highlight color, leaving the shadow color in the cracks. I do this on the body and the turret both, trying to match the lighting effect as closely as possible. It helps to put the pieces together sometimes, just to check. When that's done, you can see it's looking a lot more interesting already. I'm going to apply a coat of gloss varnish at this point. I always say that varnish is like a save button. By varnishing here, if I screw up anything later, I can scrub it away without damaging the gradients I put down, which are really hard to repair if you mess them up. I also paint all the bits that I want black at this stage as well. So time to add some detail. The first thing I'm going to do is add transfers. Transfers were something that I avoided for years because I thought they were really finicky, but they're actually easier than you think. You just cut them out, put them on a wet piece of paper towel, and let them soak. Apply microset to your miniature where you want the transfer. Having the surface nice and wet will help you move the transfer into place. When the transfer is nice and soaked, just carefully pick it up, slide it off the backing paper, and put it on your model. To get it where you want it, use the tip of a paintbrush to poke at the edges. It should slide easily on the microset underneath. Once it's where you want it, you can carefully smooth it with the paintbrush from the center out, squeezing out as much of the microset as you can from underneath. Then let that dry for a bit. If you really want the edges of the clear transfer to be super subtle, apply micro sol, which softens and dissolves the clear part. Take your time here. A few coats will have it looking positively painted on. So at this point, I painted the metallic silver bits as well. There's no great reason why I did it now, but I did, so there it is. I also added a few chunky and rough highlights on the black parts as well. I'm not going to highlight them in the conventional way, so breaking up the edges of them like that will help them to look great later on. So it's time to add some dings and scratches to the main body of the vehicle. I'm going to start with some dark brown paint on a fine paintbrush. I'm using Rhinox hide here. Just lightly touch some of these sharp edges. This is going to further define the shape of the tank by breaking up the difference between those different planes and panels, but it also adds a lot of visual interest and extra information to make the tank look more like a tiny vehicle instead of a kid's toy. The bonus is that you don't have to have very fine motor control to do this. My hands are pretty shaky sometimes, but that actually works in my favor for doing something like this. Now, along the tracks where there would have been even more wear and tear, I'm going to use a bit of sponge. This will help give me a nice random chipping effect, tiny little points of chipping that you can do with a brush but would take much longer. I dab it along wherever I think the tank would logically be chipped and scratched. I come back in with a brush to add some deep scratches and gouges as well. Along the sides I make the scratches horizontal, and on the front I make them vertical, as this makes logical sense based on how the tank would be traveling over terrain and rubble and stuff. The next thing we need to do is grime this bad boy up a little bit. And to do that, we're going to do an oil wash of mineral spirits and burnt sienna oil paint. The idea here is to scrub this on very thin over much of the model, letting it flow into the deepest recesses where it'll leave some dirty stain marks. The oil paint will also subtly stain the paint on the raised areas, giving it a warmer, varied look that'll read as some dust and grime. This will look especially good on the weapons. I try to focus on making vertical lines of stain to look like old water stains and runoff. For the treads, I pile in even more paint and pigment than the areas above. Once that's dried for a little while, I can use a Q-tip to push the paint around a little bit, clean up any surfaces where I feel like there's too much pigment, and generally tweak things. Everything's dry, it's looking a little bit too shiny, so I apply a generous coat of matte varnish which flattens the colors down, giving it a beautiful dusty flat look. And that's it. With just a few simple steps you get a nice realistic look on your Space Marine tank. We didn't have to edge highlight every edge, and we have a really interesting looking piece, and despite it being mostly one color, it does not look like a child's toy. It looks like a grown man's toy. So, that is one way to paint a tank, but tanks come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and depending on your army, you might want them to be based in a different environment or have a different feel. One of the best things you can do to ensure some level of accuracy and to decide what you like is to familiarize yourself with real-world tanks, which is why you should check out today's sponsor, World of Tanks. World of Tanks is a free game with over 100 million players worldwide, and you can choose from more than 600 tanks, including tons of historically accurate and authentic vehicles. There are over 40 battle areas featuring all kinds of environments: open fields, forests, deserts, urban industrial zones, you name it. You can earn experience, modify, and upgrade your tanks so you're ready for anything. If you're into tanks, you're probably going to love it. So download World of Tanks using the link in my description, and if you use the code TANKMANIA, you'll get a premium account free for 7 days, as well as 250,000 credits, a free premium tank, and a bunch of free rental tanks. If you're painting tanks, this game is a great source of inspiration, and it's a lot of fun as well, so check it out. Thanks to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video. The next tank we're going to paint today is an old classic, the Imperial Guard Chimera. Named after a mythical creature from the works of Homer, the Chimera tank is an armored personnel carrier, or APC, that brings Imperial Guardsmen into battle. So today we're going to paint this one in a winter camo scheme to carry my Valhallan Ice Warriors. Let me show you what I did. First of all, I primed it black, as before, and then I painted the whole thing a rich medium gray. Similar to the first tank, I highlighted with the airbrush, adding successively lighter gray to give the tank some definition and break up the flatness of the surfaces, going almost to a pure white here. At this point, I asked my brother how he thought everything was looking. He told me that he didn't realize I'd even painted anything yet. He thought it looked like unprimed gray plastic. What a wiener. Anyways, here comes the cool part. Using a small bit of sponge, I dip into some watered down white paint, and I dab on some texture on all the armor panels. Now because the paint is very thin, it's not going to completely obscure my gradient, but I end up with a much more interesting effect than just the airbrush, getting this chalky, uneven texture that makes all the panels just look more interesting. Again, like the first tank, I'm going to apply some chipping now with a sponge, but this time using German gray instead of brown. This will keep my color palette feeling nice and cold and not make the model look too muddy or dirty. As usual, I focus the chipping on the edges of the panels and then come in with a sharp tip brush to add some scratches and dings. I keep the details like the guns and the Aquilas limited to just black, silver, and white. These are going to reinforce that wintry feel by reminding you of some of those winter days where everything is desaturated and gray. On a scheme like this, transfers are the perfect way to add a tiny pop of color that just makes things look really interesting. I chose red as an accent color and applied just 2 little transfers. For a little bit more variation in detail, I used winter streaking grime to make some vertical streaks along the sides of the tank and to add some grime near the tracks. They go on kind of chunky at first, but this is an enamel based product, so with a clean brush with some white spirits on it, I can come back in afterwards and thin out the streaks, pushing and smearing them where I want and leaving a nice subtle effect. To paint the tracks, I started by brushing on some AK Dark Mud, which is another enamel product, adding a bit of mud and grime to the lower areas and some tonal variation as well. You could definitely just use a normal acrylic brown paint for this, but the enamel just makes it easier to clean up and push around the color if you don't get it exactly where you want it the first time. With that dry, I varnished the whole model, then used German gray again to overbrush the tracks, leaving that muddy rusty brown in the cracks and edges. To finish the winter effect, I'm going to add some snow to the tracks using golden molding paste. In a truly cold environment, the ground would be frozen solid and maybe below layers of ice, so snow would be the only thing caught in the tracks. I use a fairly large flat brush, press that in where I think it would settle, catching some on the lower edges of the tracks near the ground as well. And there it is, a beautiful, simple winter scheme. I think it looks incredible. For the final tank, I want to do an extra weathered desert scheme on the new Rogal Dorn Tank, which Games Workshop was kind enough to send me a copy of. The new Rogal Dorn Tank is really cool, but it has a big space under the bottom that's been the source of some controversy. Luckily, the community has come to the rescue, and people have come up with lots of solutions. I 3D printed myself a bottom plate to fill the hole using a file made by Mikey at Hellstorm Miniatures that I found on Calls 3D. It worked alright, the struts don't line up perfectly, but who looks at the bottom of the tank anyways? Come on guys. If you don't have a 3D printer, you can get one from Taro Model Maker I saw on Instagram, so there you go. Anyways, at this point you guys are probably getting pretty familiar with the first steps that I use here. Prime, paint on the base color, in this case I'm going with Khaki Gray by Vallejo, then highlight the transitions using a lighter color, in this case Khaki Gray mixed with pale sand. By the way guys, I am aware that the correct pronunciation of this paint brand is Vallejo. It contains not 1, not 2, but 3 tricks of Spanish, but I feel like Zorro every time I say that, so I'm going to keep going with Vallejo, which I think is a reasonable compromise. Now, you may be asking, why are you showing us essentially the same process 3 times in a row? And that's a fair question, and the answer is, first of all, because it's fun, second of all, because it's easy and pretty quick, and I wanted to show you how easily it can be applied to different color schemes, and third, because I had a lot of tanks to paint and this was the perfect opportunity to get a bunch of them done. There is one major technique that I'm not showing in this video that you might want to see in a video about painting tanks, and that's painting camouflage patterns on tanks. The reason why is very simple. I personally don't care for the look. I can describe to you how it's done though. The secret is masking. Let me demonstrate here some masking as I paint some stylish stripes on my tank inspired by the British Mark IV tank. First, get yourself some masking tape. I like the tapes made by Tamiya personally. This yellow one is for straight lines on straight surfaces, and this white one is used for irregular surfaces and bends around weird shapes and has a bit of stretch to it. The key here is to use a tool to poke the tape in as closely as possible into all the details to get the best fit you can. I didn't do a perfect job here because I'm going to weather this tank so heavily it won't really matter, but that's the general principle. For large organic looking blobby shapes like you see on some tanks, what I would do is I'd use some poster putty, or better yet, some specifically designed masking putty that they sell at hobby stores. And I'd simply do the first 2 steps of base color and highlight with the airbrush twice, once over the whole tank and once on the portions that I have left unmasked after masking. If you guys really want, let me know in the comments and I'll show you this in another video maybe. Anyways, similar to the others, I apply some transfers for extra detail. I used some unusual ones here. This one here is a Bretonnian Knight transfer from Warhammer Fantasy kit, and this one over here is a campaign badge from a Dark Angels kit. Again, I chose red as an accent color. This will have the added bonus of helping to tie my army together, even with snow and desert elements in it. Look at this oil wash seep into the cracks. You literally need no motor skills at all to make this happen. It's very satisfying. For the final step, I'm going to add some desert weathering to the treads. And to do that, I'm going to use another enamel wash, this time applying it quite generously to all the tread areas. The purpose of this is just to give the impression of settled dust around the track areas and any other areas where it would settle, rather than to actually have something stuck in the tracks like I did with the snow effect. When it dries, it looks nice and dusty. And there you have it, guys, a simple approach to painting tanks that's going to get all your tanks looking incredible on the table. All you need is an airbrush, a little bit of confidence, and you'll be banging these things out in no time. Don't be scared of tanks, guys. Painting them is one of the most fun things that you can do in this hobby, and I'm sad that it took me this long into my hobby journey to realize the joys of it, but hopefully you've learned something from this video that inspires you to take on your own tanks. We'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.